There is a note that a 26-year-old woman left on her father's pillow on one of the darkest nights of his entire life, just days before he became the only president in American history to resign from office. It read simply that whatever he decided to do, she would stand behind him completely. That daughter, and her older sister, spent the rest of their lives defending a father the country had turned against, while their mother quietly absorbed decades of political warfare that eventually left her partially paralyzed and confined to a hospital bed. This is the story that rarely gets told alongside Watergate. An orphan who learned to fight early. Long before she ever set foot in the White House, Pat Nixon was simply Thelma Catherine Ryan, born on March 16, 1912, in the small mining town of Ely, Nevada. Her father, William Ryan, worked as a copper miner, and he gave his infant daughter the nickname that would stay with her for the rest of her life, calling her his St. Patrick's babe in the morning, since she had been born just hours before the holiday itself. The family soon relocated to a small truck farm near Los Angeles, trading the hardship of mining life for the equally demanding work of agricultural labor. A life defined by long hours and very few comforts, one where every member of the family, regardless of age, was expected to contribute to the daily work required simply to keep the farm running. A childhood that instilled in Pat an early and lasting appreciation for hard work that would carry through the rest of her adult life. Tragedy struck early and repeatedly. Pat's mother, Katharina Halberstadt Bender Ryan, died of cancer in 1926, when Pat was just 13 years old, leaving her to take over the household duties for her father and two older brothers, a responsibility that meant cooking, cleaning, and managing an entire household while still attending school herself. 4 years later, when Pat was 18, her father died as well, from lung disease connected to his years working in the mines, leaving her a genuine orphan with no parents left to support her at all. Rather than allowing these devastating losses to derail her future, Pat worked her way through Fullerton Junior College and eventually the University of Southern California, graduating cum laude in 1937 with a degree in merchandising, having supported herself the entire time through a combination of odd jobs that included cleaning, retail work, and even a stint as an extra in Hollywood films, an experience that gave her a brief, early glimpse into exactly the kind of intense public attention that would later come to define so much of her adult life. It was this same determined, self-reliant young woman who, in 1938, met a young lawyer named Richard Nixon during rehearsals for a community theater production in Whittier, California. Nixon later admitted that he had proposed marriage to her on their very first date, a boldness that Pat found somewhat startling at the time, and it would take him roughly 2 years of persistent courtship before she finally agreed, a stretch of time during which he reportedly drove her on dates to visit other suitors, simply so he could spend more time in her company along the way, a level of devoted, almost stubborn persistence that friends of the couple later described as entirely characteristic of Richard's determined personality. The two married on June 21, 1940, at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California, beginning a partnership that would carry them through congressional campaigns, a vice presidency, a presidency, and eventually one of the most dramatic falls from power in American political history. One that would test both Pat and her two daughters in ways none of them could have possibly anticipated on their wedding day. Two daughters born into a political family. Pat and Richard Nixon's first daughter, Patricia, always known simply as Trisha, was born on February 21, 1946, arriving just as her father launched his first successful campaign for Congress. Pat had returned to working in her husband's campaign office within just 3 weeks of giving birth, setting an early pattern of dedication to her husband's political ambitions that would define much of the following decades of her life. a level of commitment that meant balancing new motherhood with the demanding, unpredictable schedule of a first-time political campaign. 2 years later, on July 5th, 1948, the couple welcomed their second daughter, Julie, born while the family was living in Washington, D.C., following Richard's successful congressional victory, a milestone that placed the family firmly within the nation's capital just as Richard's political career began accelerating in earnest. From the very beginning, the two Nixon sisters displayed noticeably different personalities, differences their own mother openly acknowledged in interviews over the years. Trisha was the more introverted of the two, later nicknamed the thinker by those close to the family, someone who required considerable time to adjust to new environments given how frequently the family relocated throughout her father's rapidly advancing political career, a pattern of near constant upheaval that meant Trisha rarely had the chance to settle comfortably into any single school or community for very long. Julie, by contrast, earned the nickname the talker, displaying an outgoing, sociable temperament from an early age that would eventually make her one of her father's most vocal and visible public defenders during the most difficult years of his presidency. A natural ease with public attention that stood in sharp contrast to her older sister's more reserved disposition. Pat herself tried, at least in the earliest years, to keep some meaningful separation between her daughter's private childhoods and her husband's increasingly public political life, hoping to preserve at least some semblance of ordinary experience for two girls who were, by virtue of their father's rapid political rise, growing up almost entirely within the public eye. That effort became considerably more difficult as Richard's career accelerated at a remarkable pace, carrying the family from the House of Representatives to the Senate, and then, within just 6 years of his first congressional victory, all the way to the vice presidency alongside Dwight Eisenhower, a trajectory that thrust both young girls into a level of public attention that would only intensify as the decades continued, culminating eventually in a level of scrutiny that few American children, before or since, have ever had to navigate throughout their own formative years. A family tested by political warfare. Pat Nixon's relationship to politics shifted dramatically during the 1952 campaign, when her husband, then the vice presidential nominee, found himself accused of maintaining a secret political slush fund, a controversy serious enough that it threatened to end his career before it had truly begun, arriving at a moment when the young family had only just begun to establish itself within Washington's political circles. Richard's response, a televised address that became known as the Checkers speech, successfully salvaged his position on the ticket. But the episode left a lasting impression on Pat regarding just how brutal and unforgiving political life could become, even for a family that had, up to that point, enjoyed a fairly steady rise through the ranks of American politics. Pat herself appeared alongside her husband during that broadcast, standing by his side as he defended himself before a national television audience, an early and formative lesson in just how publicly a family's finances and personal integrity could be scrutinized once a political career reached a certain level of prominence, a lesson that would echo throughout the remainder of their decades together in public life. The speech itself, in which Richard famously referenced a family dog named Checkers to humanize himself before the American public, became one of the defining moments of his early political career. And it taught Pat, perhaps more than any other single event up to that point, just how thoroughly political survival could depend on the willingness to lay bare even the most personal details of a family's life for public consumption. That lesson would return with devastating force decades later, once the Watergate scandal began unfolding during Richard's second presidential term. As investigators traced the 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters back to officials connected to Nixon's own re-election campaign, the pressure on the entire Nixon family intensified steadily throughout 1973 and into 1974, transforming what had once been a triumphant political dynasty into a family fighting for its very survival in the full glare of national media attention. Congressional hearings, televised testimony, and an ever-growing list of indictments against former administration officials meant that the family could rarely escape the scandal, even within the supposed privacy of the White House residence itself. Reporters camped outside the gates, and each new revelation carried with it the possibility of yet another difficult, deeply personal conversation among family members, trying to understand exactly how serious the unfolding crisis had actually become, all while continuing to project a united public front for a country watching their every move with increasing skepticism and, eventually, outright hostility. Throughout this agonizing period, both Trisha and Julie remained fiercely loyal to their father, defending him publicly even as the evidence against him continued mounting and public opinion turned decisively against the administration. Julie, in particular, became known as one of her father's most consistent and outspoken defenders, a role that earned her recognition as one of the 10 most admired women in America for 4 consecutive years during the 1970s, according to a Good Housekeeping magazine poll. An unusual distinction for a young woman whose primary public role was simply standing beside a father the country had grown increasingly hostile toward. She gave interviews, made public appearances, and consistently pushed back against critics of her father's administration, displaying a level of composure and conviction that impressed even many of the president's political opponents. But even as the daughters projected outward strength and unwavering loyalty, the toll the scandal was taking on their mother, largely hidden from public view, would eventually reveal itself in devastating and permanent ways. Pat rarely spoke publicly about her own private anguish during this period, maintaining the same reserved, dignified public composure that had defined her entire adult life, even as those closest to the family later described just how deeply the mounting scandal and the accompanying public humiliation had begun to wear on her physically and emotionally, long before any of that internal strain became visible to the wider public. The night before the resignation. By the summer of 1974, the walls had closed in entirely around the Nixon presidency. The Supreme Court had forced Richard to surrender his Oval Office tape recordings to Senate investigators, and once those recordings became public, they revealed his direct involvement in the Watergate cover-up beyond any reasonable doubt. Facing near certain impeachment, Richard made the agonizing decision to resign from the presidency, becoming the only president in American history to do so. A decision that had been building for weeks as advisors and allies alike increasingly concluded that his position had become genuinely untenable. The night before he announced his decision publicly, Richard gathered his family together for what would become one of the most emotionally raw evenings of their entire lives. According to Richard's own later recollections, Pat came down emphatically against the idea of resigning, insisting until nearly the very end that he continue fighting rather than step down, a fighter's instinct that had carried her through every previous crisis of their long political partnership, one rooted in the same resilience that had once carried her through the deaths of both of her parents decades earlier. Despite her strong objections, Richard ultimately decided resignation was the only remaining path forward, a decision that devastated the entire family, even as they understood the legal and political realities, leaving him with few other viable options. It was that same difficult night that Julie left the handwritten note on her father's pillow, telling him simply that she loved him and would support him completely, whatever he ultimately decided to do. A small but deeply personal gesture from a daughter who had spent the better part of 2 years defending her father publicly, only to now face the reality that his presidency itself could not be saved. A photograph taken that same evening, showing the entire family gathered together in a moment of shared grief, would later become one of the most quietly devastating images connected to the entire Watergate saga. capturing a family bracing itself for a loss that no amount of public loyalty or private conviction could ultimately prevent. Those present that night later described an atmosphere heavy with a mixture of grief, resignation, and lingering disbelief that a presidency which had once seemed so secure could unravel so completely within the span of just 2 years. A collapse that none of them, even amid the mounting evidence, had fully allowed themselves to imagine until that final, unavoidable night, one that left every member of the family searching for the right words to offer one another, even as none of them could truly find any that felt adequate to the moment. On the morning of August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon formally resigned the presidency, and the family departed the White House by helicopter, an image that would become one of the most enduring and painful visual symbols of the entire Watergate era, broadcast and rebroadcast countless times in the decades that followed as a kind of visual shorthand for the fall of an American presidency. For Pat Nixon, who had spent decades quietly absorbing the pressures of political life without ever publicly showing how much any of it hurt her, that helicopter flight into exile marked the beginning of a health decline that would ultimately prove impossible to reverse. A body that finally gave out. Following the resignation, Richard and Pat retreated to La Casa Pacifica, their home in San Clemente, California, hoping to rebuild some version of a private life away from the relentless scrutiny that had defined the previous several years. But the physical toll of everything the family had endured was only beginning to surface. In late October of 1974, Richard himself underwent emergency surgery to remove a dangerous blood clot, a procedure complicated by internal bleeding that required a second operation and an extended hospital stay. A genuinely frightening medical crisis that arrived just weeks after his resignation, and that left the entire family reeling from yet another sudden emergency during an already exhausting and painful period of adjustment to private life. Then, in July of 1976, Pat herself suffered a major stroke while sitting alone reading at their home, initially telling no one in the family what had happened before eventually going up to bed, only for the full severity of the episode to become clear the following day. The stroke left her with significant weakness throughout the left side of her face, arm, and leg, along with slurred speech, and doctors initially described her condition as serious enough that the next several days would prove crucial in determining her chances of a meaningful recovery. She was rushed by ambulance to Memorial Hospital Medical Center in Long Beach, accompanied on the journey by her husband and her younger daughter Julie, who remained close by her bedside throughout the initial crisis, while Trisha, reached by phone in New York, rushed to join the rest of the family as quickly as she could arrange travel, boarding one of the earliest available flights west once she learned the severity of her mother's condition. The hospital itself was quickly surrounded by reporters and well-wishers alike, a reminder that even in the depths of a genuine medical emergency, the family could not fully escape the same intense public attention that had followed them for decades. Richard, addressing reporters outside the hospital, expressed confidence that his wife would make a complete recovery, describing her as a fighter who would see the crisis through, language that echoed almost exactly how Pat herself had once described her husband's own political battles throughout their decades together. A small but telling reflection of just how deeply intertwined their two identities and their two respective forms of resilience had become after more than 3 decades of marriage. Doctors treating her at the time noted that the considerable stress of the preceding years, including the resignation and its aftermath, certainly could have been a contributing factor toward her sudden illness, even as they were careful to avoid drawing any definitive medical conclusion about the precise cause. Richard later suggested, in reflecting on the timing of his wife's stroke, that it may have been connected to her having recently read a particularly harsh account of the Watergate scandal, a book that reportedly left her deeply shaken just days before the stroke occurred. though doctors were careful to note that any direct causal link remained impossible to prove definitively. What was clear, however, was that Pat's health would never fully return to what it had been before that difficult night. She made a painful recovery through months of dedicated physical therapy, regaining much of her mobility and speech. But the stroke marked the beginning of a series of health complications that would continue for the remainder of her life. Complications that would eventually reveal themselves as far more serious than anyone in the family initially understood. The final diagnosis nobody saw coming. Throughout the years following her 1976 stroke, Pat Nixon continued facing a steady accumulation of health difficulties. She suffered a second, milder stroke in 1983, along with repeated hospitalizations for asthmatic bronchitis, bronchial pneumonia, and various lung infections that increasingly limited her ability to participate in public life the way she once had, gradually reducing her public appearances, even as she remained determined to maintain as much normalcy as her declining health would reasonably allow, continuing to attend family gatherings and occasional public events whenever her condition permitted it. In 1987, she underwent surgery to remove a small cancerous tumor from her mouth, a procedure that, while successful, added yet another layer of concern to a health history already marked by considerable difficulty, and one that friends of the family later described as a sobering reminder of just how fragile her overall health had become by that point in her life. By early 1993, Pat's condition had deteriorated to the point that she required hospitalization for emphysema, a chronic lung disease that made ordinary breathing increasingly difficult, and that had, by that point, been quietly affecting her for a considerable period of time without full public acknowledgement, a reality she had reportedly managed for months without disclosing its full severity even to those closest to her. It was during this hospitalization that the family first learned the devastating truth. Pat had lung cancer, a diagnosis that Richard revealed publicly around the same time he acknowledged her long struggle with emphysema, a double blow that made clear just how serious her overall condition had become after so many years of accumulating health complications. The family made the decision to keep her at home for her final weeks rather than continuing extended hospital care, surrounding her with the same steady, quiet devotion that had defined so much of her decades in public life, choosing to prioritize comfort and familiar surroundings over further aggressive medical intervention once the severity of her diagnosis became clear. Pat Nixon died on June 23, 1993, at the family's home in Park Ridge, New Jersey, at the age of 81. Richard and both of their daughters, Trisha and Julie, were with her when she passed away at 5:45 in the morning, just one day after what would have marked the couple's 53rd wedding anniversary, an almost unbearably poignant piece of timing for a family that had already endured so much together across more than 5 decades of marriage, one that Richard himself later described as one of the most painful coincidences of his entire life. Tributes poured in from across the political spectrum in the days that followed, with even many of the president's former critics acknowledging the genuine grace and quiet strength Pat Nixon had displayed throughout her decades in public life, regardless of how they had once viewed her husband's own record in office. A rare moment of near-universal respect for a woman whose own personal story had so often been overshadowed by the far more contentious debates surrounding her husband's political career. In the years and decades since, those who studied Pat Nixon's life often described her as the uncomplaining, silent partner in her husband's extraordinary career, a woman who endured the dark years of Watergate and the pain of his resignation without ever publicly revealing just how deeply any of it had wounded her. A quiet dignity that both of her daughters would go on to carry forward in their own distinct ways as they built their adult lives entirely within the long shadow of their father's complicated legacy. Trisha's quiet path through the public eye. As the elder of the two Nixon daughters, Trisha navigated a childhood and young adulthood defined by nearly constant relocation and public scrutiny, attending numerous schools throughout her father's rapidly ascending political career, before eventually settling into her studies at Sidwell Friends and completing her education at Finch College in Manhattan. Despite her naturally introverted personality, Trisha proved capable of genuine academic and social achievement, earning election as class president during her junior year and membership in her school's academic honor society, accomplishments that suggested a young woman considerably more capable and engaged than her reserved public image sometimes conveyed to outside observers who knew her only through occasional press coverage. A quiet competence that friends from her school years often described as easy to overlook, simply because she rarely sought attention for it herself. Trisha was still living at home when her family moved into the White House in January of 1969, and with her younger sister Julie already married and living in Massachusetts, Trisha found herself stepping into an unofficial role as Assistant First Lady, presiding over numerous White House events during her mother's absences, and even hosting a televised tour of the family's private living quarters alongside veteran journalist Mike Wallace. It was a considerable public responsibility for someone whose own mother had described her as naturally reserved. Yet Trisha handled the role with the same quiet composure that had come to define much of her mother's own approach to public life, rarely showing outward discomfort, even in situations that would have proven genuinely challenging for someone with her more introverted temperament. A poise that staff members who worked closely with her during this period often remarked upon with genuine admiration. On June 12th, 1971, Trisha married Harvard law student Edward Cox in a ceremony held in the White House Rose Garden, the very first outdoor wedding ever held at the presidential residence. First Lady Pat Nixon had personally suggested the outdoor setting, despite considerable staff concern over Washington's notoriously unpredictable summer weather, and White House staff reportedly prepared an entire contingency plan for an indoor ceremony in case rain forced a last-minute change of venue. The ceremony, broadcast to a national television audience, became one of the most widely watched White House events of the entire Nixon administration, drawing considerable public fascination given how rarely a presidential daughter's wedding had ever been staged with quite this level of pageantry and outdoor grandeur. Edward Cox, whose own family carried a distinguished legal and business background, including a grandfather who had served as a judge on the New York Court of Appeals and a father who had been a decorated World War II aviator, went on to build a career as a corporate attorney and became active in New York Republican politics, eventually chairing the state party. He had formally asked President Nixon for Trisha's hand in marriage during a November weekend in 1970, with the president reportedly telling the young suitor that what mattered most to him was simply what Trisha herself wanted, a response that friends of the family described as characteristic of the genuine warmth Richard privately displayed toward his daughters, a side of his personality that rarely came through in his more guarded public persona. Nixon later sent his daughter a brief but heartfelt note congratulating her on her decision, expressing confidence that she and Edward would look back on that particular moment as a genuinely splendid one in their shared life together. The couple went on to have one son together, Christopher Nixon Cox, who would eventually pursue his own career in law and public service, continuing the family's connection to both legal practice and political engagement into yet another generation. Following her father's resignation and the difficult years that immediately followed, Trisha largely stepped back from the intense public visibility that had defined her earlier years, choosing instead to build a quieter private life in New York, while remaining consistently devoted to preserving her parents' legacy. She granted relatively few interviews in the decades that followed, compared to her more outspoken younger sister, generally preferring to let her actions, particularly her continued involvement with institutions dedicated to her parents' memory, speak for her rather than engaging extensively with the media. but it would be her younger sister, Julie, the more naturally outgoing and vocal of the two, whose own path through adulthood would ultimately place her even more directly and publicly at the center of her father's ongoing legacy and reputation for decades to come. Julie's lifelong defense of her father's name. Julie Nixon's own path through adulthood carried her into a marriage that, much like her sisters, connected two of the most prominent political families in the entire country. In 1968, she married David Eisenhower, grandson of former President Dwight Eisenhower, in a private ceremony in New York held shortly after her own father had just won the presidency himself. A union that brought together the Nixon and Eisenhower political dynasties in a way that captured considerable public fascination at the time, with newspapers and magazines eager to cover a match that seemed to symbolize a kind of continuity between two of the most significant Republican political families of the entire post-war era. Unlike her older sister's later, more elaborate White House ceremony, Julie's own wedding remained intentionally small and intimate, reflecting perhaps her family's more modest circumstances at that particular moment, arriving just before her father's inauguration rather than during the more established years of his presidency, a timing that meant the young couple began their married life together right as the entire Nixon family prepared for the enormous transition into national political leadership. The wedding took place with relatively little of the pageantry that would later define Trisha's own ceremony, a quieter beginning to a marriage that would nonetheless carry Julie into an equally demanding and publicly scrutinized chapter of her own adult life over the following years. Throughout her father's presidency, Julie worked as assistant managing editor of the Saturday Evening Post, while simultaneously carrying the unofficial title of First Daughter, a dual role that placed genuine professional responsibilities alongside her more symbolic public duties. It was a considerable balancing act for a young woman still in her early 20s, managing an actual editorial career at a nationally circulated magazine, while also fulfilling the kind of ceremonial and representational duties expected of a president's daughter. Responsibilities that only intensified as her father's second term grew increasingly consumed by the unfolding Watergate crisis, leaving her to navigate the demands of a genuine career alongside an ever-expanding set of public obligations that few young women her age could have possibly imagined having to manage simultaneously. As Watergate increasingly consumed the administration throughout 1973 and 1974, Julie emerged as one of her father's most consistently visible and outspoken public defenders, appearing in interviews and public forums to advocate for her father, even as public sentiment continued shifting dramatically against him, a level of public loyalty that earned her genuine national recognition, including that distinction as one of America's most admired women across 4 separate years during the decade. She traveled extensively during this period, speaking to audiences across the country and fielding difficult, often hostile questions about her father's conduct, with a composure that impressed even many observers who remained deeply skeptical of the administration itself, a poise that friends and colleagues attributed to the same steady resilience her mother had modeled for both daughters throughout their entire childhoods. Interviewers who spoke with her during this period frequently remarked on just how measured and thoughtful her responses remained, even when pressed on the most damaging revelations emerging from the ongoing congressional investigation. In the decades following her father's resignation and eventual death in 1994, Julie built a genuine career as an author, writing extensively about both of her parents' lives, including a well-regarded biography of her mother, published in 1986, that offered readers a considerably more intimate and humanizing portrait of Pat Nixon than the public had generally been permitted to see during her years in the White House. That biography, drawing on personal memories, family letters, and extensive research, helped reshape public understanding of a woman who had so often been characterized during her years as First Lady as reserved and difficult to truly know. offering instead a portrait of a genuinely resilient, hard-working woman whose own remarkable personal history had been largely overshadowed by her husband's far more dramatic political career. Critics who reviewed the book at the time noted its unusually candid and detailed treatment of Pat's difficult childhood, her years of quiet sacrifice on behalf of her husband's ambitions, and the physical toll that decades of political life had eventually taken on her, offering readers a far more complete picture than the carefully controlled public image most Americans had grown accustomed to seeing during her years in Washington. Julie and David Eisenhower went on to have 3 children together, including a daughter named Jenny, continuing the connection between the two prominent political families into an entirely new generation. Julie has remained one of the most consistent and dedicated stewards of her father's legacy throughout the decades since his death, working alongside her sister Trisha to preserve and share their parents' story through the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Foundation, an institution both sisters have continued supporting well into their own later decades of life, ensuring that their parents' complicated legacy would be preserved and presented according to their own understanding of who their mother and father truly were, beyond the simplified narratives that so often dominate public discussions of the Nixon presidency. The family legacy carried forward. Today, both Trisha Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower continue serving on the board of directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving and sharing their parents' complicated and consequential place in American history. Trisha's son, Christopher, and Julie's daughter, Melanie, have both gone on to serve on that same board as well, extending the family's stewardship of their grandparents' legacy into a third generation, a continuity that speaks to just how central the preservation of their parents' story has remained across the decades since Richard's resignation and eventual death. The foundation itself has worked over the years to present a fuller, more nuanced picture of the Nixon presidency, one that acknowledges the genuine achievements of the administration, including significant foreign policy breakthroughs, alongside the undeniable weight of the Watergate scandal that ultimately ended it, an ongoing effort that both daughters have supported as part of their broader commitment to ensuring their parents' full story, not simply its most dramatic and controversial chapter, remains part of the historical record for future generations to consider. Looking back across the full arc of this family's story, what emerges is a portrait considerably more complicated and more genuinely human than the political scandal that so often dominates any discussion of the Nixon presidency. Pat Nixon endured decades of political warfare with a composure that ultimately extracted a devastating physical toll, one that culminated in a stroke, years of declining health, and finally a cancer diagnosis that claimed her life at 81. Her journey from an orphaned teenager working her way through college to First Lady of the United States, only to spend her final 2 decades battling one health crisis after another, stands as one of the more quietly remarkable and quietly tragic personal stories connected to any American presidential family of the 20th century. Her 2 daughters, shaped from early childhood by their father's relentless political ascent, each found their own way of carrying forward both genuine love for their parents and an enduring commitment to defending a family name that the country had, for a time, turned decisively against. Trisha chose a quieter, more private path following the resignation, stepping back from the intense public visibility of her earlier years while still remaining devoted to her parents' legacy from a greater distance. Julie, by contrast, embraced a far more public role as both defender and, eventually, biographer of her parents, using her own considerable writing talent to ensure that a fuller, more complete version of her mother's story in particular would not be lost to the more sensational headlines that so often surrounded her father's political career. Whatever judgment history ultimately renders on Richard Nixon's presidency, The story of the wife and daughters who stood beside him through every stage of that journey, quietly enduring costs the public rarely fully understood, remains one of the more overlooked chapters connected to one of the most consequential and controversial political families in modern American history. Pat Nixon's own resilience, forged decades earlier through the deaths of both of her parents and a childhood defined by hard work and self-reliance, carried her through triumphs and public humiliations that few American First Ladies have ever had to endure in quite the same measure. And it is a resilience that both of her daughters, in their own distinct and deeply personal ways, have continued honoring for more than 3 decades since her passing. From an orphaned teenager working her way through college in California to a First Lady enduring a national scandal that ended her husband's presidency, and finally to a mother whose own 2 daughters carried her memory forward with the same quiet dignity she had modeled for them throughout their entire lives. Pat Nixon's story remains one of the more genuinely remarkable and genuinely underappreciated personal histories connected to any family that has ever occupied the White House. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.